Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The State of Trade, the Secret Key to U.S. Trade Negotiations. This webinar is our June event for the State of Trade webinar series, a monthly series of experts offering timely insights into the rapidly changing world of international trade. Before we get to the substance, let's cover a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you can see multiple application widgets that are there for you to use. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. You'll be able to find a copy of today's slide deck in the additional materials on the bottom left. We also invite you to join us this Thursday for a TPEB freight market update, and you can find a link to register for this on the top right. Please ask questions through the Q&A widget on the right. Time permitting, we will try to get to as many of those as we can during the webinar. We also very much appreciate it if you would share with us other webinar topics you'd like us to explore, or just any thoughts you have about the program. Our goal is, of course, to share valuable insights, and it's much easier if we know what you think is valuable. So a quick survey is on the bottom right. And finally, an on-demand version of the webinar will be available shortly after the webinar and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. All right, and now the part for the lawyers. Please do keep in mind that all information provided in this webinar is presented based on the situation at the time and may not be customized to your specific situation. All right, what have we got for you today? I'm Phil Levy, I'm Chief Economist at Flexport, and we are very fortunate to be joined by two thoughtful guests on a timely topic. With us, we have Tori Smith, who is the J. Van Andel Trade Economist at the Heritage Foundation, where she advocates for free trade and specializes in analyzing the impacts of protectionist trade policies on American families and the economy. Before joining Heritage in 2015, she worked in the Michigan House of Representatives as a legislative aide, and she did undergraduate work at Michigan State University, but she's still very thoughtful. I say that as a Michigan grad. And she has a master's degree in international commerce and policy with a concentration in global finance, investment, and trade from George Mason University. Tori, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we are also very fortunate to have Tim Meyer, who is professor of law and director of the International Legal Studies program at Vanderbilt Law School. He is an expert in public international law with specialties in international trade, investment, and environmental law. He is researching how international economic agreements relate and respond to concerns about economic opportunity and inequality, and how trade law can facilitate the integration of trade and climate policy. His past research has examined the interaction of international and local rules on energy subsidies, the role of local governments in free trade agreements, and the creation of non-binding soft law obligations. Tim, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we got a lot to talk about today. Here's just to give you an idea of where we're going, and just to give a little background of why we're talking about this. We at State of Trade are entirely capable of bringing up a topic just because it's arcane and we like to talk about those kind of things, but that's not what's happening today. Trade Promotion Authority really is the secret key to understanding U.S. trade policy. It's often the hidden answer to questions like, will we have a free trade agreement with the UK later this year? So not only do we have relevance, we have timeliness. The existing Trade Promotion Authority expires in just over 1 week. I think it's 8 days, actually. And unless it's replaced, that'll leave the president without trade negotiating authority for the first time since 2015. And so our plan for today is to discuss what all of that means. We'll talk about what TPA is and what role it plays. We'll take a couple different cuts at the trade agenda. What's at stake? Why do you want to have negotiating authority anyways? We'll look at the countries with which we could potentially do deals and some of the issues that are on the table for what should those trade agreements look like. Because TPA, I have often argued, serves as something of a blueprint, or if it's respected, it's a blueprint for what trade deals will look like. And so when you talk about what TPA should be or will be, you're actually describing a lot what the deals might look like. We'll then talk a bit about the politics of this. Is it likely to pass? What's at stake and what are the determinants? And we'll close with a bit of what comes next. All right, before we get to all that, as is our habit, we want to hear what you all think. And in particular, with the idea that a lot of this is the key to having new trade agreements, I wanted to start by asking, how important are U.S. trade agreements to your business. So the choices we're giving you are, they're important, but I have what I need with existing agreements. Second choice, new agreements are important, and it matters most what countries those agreements would include. Alternatively, new agreements are important, and it matters most what new issues are covered in those agreements. Or you say, it's political theater, it doesn't make a lot of difference to my business, there's not supposed to be a question mark there, but maybe you end in sort of a degree of doubt. Or finally, I don't know, ask me after the webinar. So again, those are your choices. I see some of you have voted already. We value your opinion, so please take a moment and say, essentially, do you care very much about U.S. trade agreements? And do you care, but it's fine, it's all taken care of? Or do you care going forward thinking, this is something that's important and you'd like to see more of it? And if so, why? All right, thank you for those who have voted. We're starting to get towards a critical mass. Let me just give a moment or two more as we tally up the answers. The underpaid interns scurrying back and forth. No, I'm just kidding. It's all electronic. But all right. So to see what your takes are on the importance of U.S. trade agreements to your business, going once, going twice, your last chance to have a voice. All right. Survey says, all right. Heavily on, of course, there's a bit of a selection bias. That's why you tune in. But new agreements are important. And much more heavily on which countries we would have those agreements with. But then coming in next are, what are the issues that come up? All right, thank you for that. So we're going to try and give an idea of how likely are we to have new trade agreements, and we're going to try to persuade you that TPA is key to this. All right, so let me just start with giving a little historical background, and then I'm going to bring in our guests with their expertise. Okay, once upon a time, Congress made trade policy. It's actually in the Constitution. I sort of quote it here because it's fun showing pictures of old parchment. But this was the rule given by the Constitution. I'm no lawyer, but we have one here to correct me just in case. But part of the idea was Congress had the power of the purse. Actually, it's hard to remember, but tariffs were a big part of the power of the purse. That if you go back a couple hundred years, it wasn't easy to collect money through income taxes. That was partly because we didn't have an income tax, and also because it was a heck of a lot easier to collect money from ships coming into ports than it was to go around and find out what everybody was doing with their consulting businesses. So I'm digressing a little bit. In any case, what we had was Congress passing tariff acts, and we had a whole series of these. Infamously, if we're looking at, like, say, the first part of the last century, you got to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which there was a pretty broad consensus after that had been in place for a while in the 1930s. This hadn't gone very well. And the Roosevelt administration wanted to do something about that. The U.S. had raised tariffs. Other countries raised tariffs too. There was a general sense that if they reciprocally lowered tariffs, people might be better off. But how did you actually achieve that? Difficult when it's Congress with all of its membership that's supposed to be negotiating these things, much easier for the executive to do. So they had a delegation of authority. And the original version, and we see a signing picture here, was the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. We will not go through the whole history. I will say that there have been a number of changes over time. And the few things that I would note, one, the terms of all this have certainly changed over time. The name has changed over time. That for a while, this was known as Fast Track. After a while, that sounded like you had a bunch of free trade ideologues who were being reckless and trying to jam agreements through. So then it was called Trade Promotion Authority, which is the name that it's going by now. The other thing that I would note on this is, while this all started in 1934, it has not been continuous. We have had lapses in coverage before. And so one of the things we can talk about as we appear to be headed towards another such lapse is, what does that mean? What effect does that have that there's a lapse? All right, just to define TPA quickly, and then I'm going to call on Tori to say a bit more about why we should care and what the current situation is. The way I often think about it, key elements of what TPA offers. It's a deal between Congress and the executive. It says to the executive, you can go off and negotiate trade agreements. And here's what Congress promises. Congress promises that you will get a defined timeline, that Congress won't sit on it forever. There will be deadlines for getting it through House committees, House floor, Senate committee, Senate floor. Congress promises not to make amendments, which would then sort of undo some carefully balanced deal. And the Senate says it's not going to filibuster. So this is not a 60 vote thing in the Senate. It's a simple majority. All of that is contingent on the executive branch following whatever rules or requirements were set out in TPA, in the Trade Promotion Authority document. So that's this. You know, before I sort of show an intricate thing, I'll put this up as background. This is what the timeline looks like. But Tori, let me kick it over to you. You've just written a piece, and we have this linked on the page, telling Congress what it should think about TPA. Share with us, what should we think about TPA? Why is this important? And why should we worry about it now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil. And I printed it out as a little shameless plug for everyone. So you can check it out on heritage.org as well, if you'd like, fresh off the presses. But we should care about TPA because it makes getting trade agreements, theoretically, across the finish line easier. Because it allows for, as Phil mentioned, the expedited process. And, you know, before, trade agreements were mostly about adjusting tariff barriers. And the original provisions that Phil had mentioned under the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act were actually about eliminating and lowering tariffs. But that's not really where our trade agreements are at these days. It's much more about non-tariff barriers, regulations, and those sorts of things. And so the president obviously cannot do that on his own. And that is part of the reason why TPA and fast track is so necessary. Under TPA, there is a provision that allows the president to adjust tariff rates within certain margins, essentially without an additional act of Congress, but that does not exist for the other provisions, and that's why we need it. Otherwise, you could see a trade agreement, subject to filibuster, subject to endless vote-a-ramas and amendments, and really never get moving. And that causes, I think, some uncertainty for the business community because you're unsure about what the rules may be. And we got a little taste of this, I think, with the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA. There were several months where businesses were unsure, especially the auto sector. You know, what are our rules going to be? How are we going to be able to maintain our tariff-free status? And in theory, TPA allows that process to go a little bit more quickly so that we can get those rules clearly defined and through the legislative process.
Thanks. And you made that mention of there's some authority to adjust things. Am I right? That's what happened with the Japan agreement that we saw under the Trump administration, right? That it was using just that authority. It wasn't a full-fledged trade agreement, but it used some of this, which is why it then didn't go through Congress. Is that right, Tori?
Yeah, that's right. And there's been several different iterations of examples like that, but the Japan one is one of the most recent examples. And this is under Section 103 of Trade Promotion Authority, and it allows the president to make those margin changes to tariff rates. Now, the problem with that side of the authority being delegated without congressional involvement or approval is that it allows for things that could potentially violate our commitments under the WTO. Because as many people in the trade community know, our trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, what they call the WTO, have to cover substantially all trade to be able to be considered compliant under the WTO rules. And it's possible that that Japan agreement did not meet our commitments, and that runs us into an issue. It puts the U.S. at risk of having a case filed against it, or Japan having a case filed against it at the WTO. And so it calls into question, should Congress be involved to ensure that our trade agreements are encompassing virtually all trade and not running afoul of our commitments.
Okay, great, thank you, Tim. I want to get your general take on TPA, but let me also sort of add to this question and say we seem to have been in an era where TPA is all about the balance of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch. We seem to have been in an era where executive power has increased. What Tori was just talking about, the stuff that happened with Japan, again, a bit of an expansion potentially of executive power. With that expanded executive power, is TPA still important for striking trade deals?
So I basically agree with Tori, which is to say that, if you're going to do trade deals that have a significant scope to them, that are going to involve all these what we call non-tariff barriers, these provisions that have over time, increasingly expanded. If you've ever looked at a recent U.S. trade agreement, they're 30 chapters long. There's so much in there that requires legislation. An agreement of that scope is going to require congressional participation. There is opportunity for the president, and you see this in trade, but you see this in other areas as well, in which the administration is increasingly willing to rely on existing delegations of authority as a basis for entering into international commitments. Climate change is another area where you see this. And so, part of what's going on there is that you're seeing the various administrations getting frustrated with the pace at which legislation moves through Congress. And so there's a sense in which I think TPA does allow Congress to be a more meaningful participant in the formulation of these kinds of trade agreements. At the same time, though, it's a much more constrained participation than you would see through the ordinary legislative process. So there's a trade-off between the extent to which you see congressional participation. TPA clearly enables it. At the same time, you're also seeing a much more constrained way in which the interests that are represented in Congress are able to actually interact with the administration's trade policy via TPA, because they can't make amendments, because they can't filibuster, those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. One of the things I wanted to follow up on, which I sort of teased early on, I want to take just a moment before we move on to the issues in the countries. Let's suppose that, according to plan, nothing dramatic happens and we do get the expiration of TPA within 8 days. Am I right in thinking that this means that some of these agreements that we've been actively going after, such as the one with the UK, they're on ice until we get something, assuming that this is not signed, in the next week? Does that effectively put a freeze on things? Tim, let me start with you on this.
It doesn't really put a freeze on negotiations. People forget. So the Obama administration began the TPP negotiations before it had trade promotion authority. And so, there's no particular reason that the administration couldn't continue discussions while putting TPA itself on hold. It's also the case that, in theory, it's possible for a trade agreement to be approved by Congress and implementing legislation passed without TPA. Since 1974, I think it's only happened once in the case of Jordan, but it is possible for that to happen. I think to say that it puts them on ice if TPA expires is a little bit too strong, because the administration does retain the ability and the initiative to conduct negotiations while delaying, the sort of domestic legal framework that would ultimately support those negotiations.
Yeah, of course, the TPP example may not be one that one wants to hold up as a success story for what happens when you negotiate without TPA. Tori, what is your take? How important is this for? We just had, in the poll we did where people said it's new countries, that's what I care about. What does it mean if TPA expires and is not quickly replaced?
Yeah, I would agree with Tim. I think putting it on ice is a little bit too strong, but I do think that without the buy-in from both sides on the trade agenda, which TPA provides, it requires a lot of cooperation, not only throughout the negotiation process, but to even get the mechanism across the finish line requires a certain amount of buy-in between the two sides. Without that, you kind of have Congress and the White House operating on separate pages a little bit and separate priorities. You can see that, for example, under the Trump administration, we have TPA, but Congress was calling for U.S.-Taiwan FTA while the Trump administration was moving forward with the U.S.-Kenya FTA. Now, obviously, these are like apples and oranges, but it's a clear sort of crossing of the lines. I think that happens even more when you have less required cooperation between the two sides throughout the process. So we'll see what happens. I think you probably won't have a lot of formal trade agreement negotiations for the next couple of years under the Biden administration unless we get a new TPA across the finish line.
Okay, well, that makes for a great segue into talking about the agenda, because we've now raised this both in terms of countries and in terms of what the substance is going to be. So that's what we want to turn to next, is these two big facets of the agenda. And once again, we want to go out to you, the audience, and find out what you think. You already told us that you cared about which countries we do trade deals with. Now we want you to be a little bit more specific. So we've got a large offering here, so we'll see if we get a really fragmented vote. But these are all things that could be affected by TPA one way or the other. So the question we're posing is, what U.S. trade agreement would you most like to see concluded next? So Tori just described the sort of executive rule in agenda setting, and do you do Taiwan or do you do Kenya? We've got both of them on the list. So here are your offerings. Brazil. There was a deal with Brazil which fell well short of a trade agreement, but it was sort of often those things are precursors. The CPTPP, for those of you who are fans of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this is what it evolved into. So this is the broader Trans-Pacific deal, which the Obama administration had negotiated, but President Trump declined to join. Something with the European Union. This isn't novel. We did have, when this guy, Joe Biden, was vice president, we had this transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which was supposed to get done on one tank of gas, but that tank ran dry and they never got there. So European Union, Japan. We just talked about Japan as something where there was a sort of residual executive authority to make an executive agreement. Should that be a full-scale agreement? Japan is also part of the CPTPP. This stuff gets complicated. That's why you need the experts. Kenya, which were discussions that started. Taiwan, where there certainly is a constituency to think about this. The United Kingdom, those negotiations are fairly advanced. And I don't want to leave out the possibility of multilateralism, because a multilateral deal, something at the World Trade Organization, would also be covered by TPA. So quite a menu. No one's going to hold you to account for it, but pick your favorite. If you were going to see, sort of this gets to the question of how much we care about Trade Promotion Authority, what do we want it for? Which country or region would be most beneficial to have the next U.S. agreement concluded? What is it that you're waiting for? All right. Many of you have voted. Thank you for that. I'll give a moment or two more. Very much like to hear what you say. See what you're hoping for with all of these things. And, okay, going once, going twice. Survey says you all want to see the CPTPP. Not exclusively. We've got a range of things. This is interesting. It's certainly the most advanced of all the deals out there, and there's a little bit, this sort of minimal, not a big constituency for Kenya. So, Tori, anything that surprises you in this reaction in terms of where the Vox Populi is?
No, I think it's not surprising to see a desire to get into the CPTPP. You actually just saw a hearing yesterday, I believe in the Senate Finance Trade Subcommittee, that focused a lot on CPTPP, and I think a lot on it being an important agreement to address our security challenges in Asia and to compete with RCEP and to compete with China. So it's not surprising to see that at all.
Tim, what's your take?
Again, I agree with Tori. I mean, I think, CPTPP is the biggest agreement that is out there, in terms of coverage. We essentially completed the negotiations under the Obama administration. So of everything that's on the agenda. I personally, I don't think rejoining CPTPP is an easy lift. I wouldn't call it an easy lift, but I do think it's probably the easiest lift as a relative matter, just given the history with the agreement.
Yeah, so can I add one more thing in that I forgot?
Of course.
That maybe folks may not realize that the likelihood of a potential CPTPP rejoining could actually be a backdoor agreement with the UK, because the UK is currently working on joining the CPTPP right now. I don't know how they're transatlantic or trans-Pacific, but they're looking to join, and I think that could maybe put some more pressure on both sides potentially, because folks definitely want a US-UK, but I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, so let's delve into a couple aspects of this, because we want to talk about the sort of the countries, and then we're going to move on to the issues at stake. But let's think. We were having a discussion earlier on the CPTPP, and so Tori, you just mentioned one of the sort of classic moves to say, how do you revisit something which you had initially said no to, but then maybe say yes, is you get some changes. And so if you say, no, this is new and improved, this is different, this isn't the thing we rejected the last time. So one option in terms of participation is you did not have the UK for perhaps geographic reasons in the CPTPP. You also didn't have countries like Korea in the CPTPP. So you could try and expand membership or do something like this. I wanted to see what you guys thought of. I'm going to put the general question. What would it take to get us to a CPTPP, and how contingent would this be on actually getting new TPA? So, Tim, why don't you start us off, and then we can go back to Tori on that.
Sure. So, I think the major issue here is a political one, and that is that the U.S. Failure to get CPTPP, or what was then TPP, through Congress at the end of the Obama administration has created, essentially tainted the TPP in sort of U.S. politics. And so I think what you see from the Biden administration is a reluctance to own the effort to rejoin CPTPP. And what they're really waiting for is a demonstration from Congress on a bipartisan basis that there really is this interest from Congress. They want Congress to own that decision to get back in. Now, I think the lever that makes that happen, if it happens, there are a couple things, but the main lever that's going to drive that, I think, is probably China. The Obama administration tried to sell TPP as a effort to encircle China and write essentially the trade rules for the road. And they weren't entirely effective, I think, in either maybe in technically how they did that in the agreement, as well as messaging it. And so I would expect, one of the only things that on the trade agenda that has generated through the Trump administration, the Biden administration, bipartisan support is efforts to take on China as part of the trade agenda. And so, that is one of the things. The second thing that you'd see, I think, is you'd see an effort to really increase the labor and the environmental provisions. The original TPP actually was at the time state of the art in terms of efforts to boost labor and environmental provisions. USMCA now includes additional mechanisms, particularly the rapid response mechanism. And I think you would be likely to see the administration at a minimum try to incorporate those kinds of mechanisms into CPTPP before we could even talk about rejoining it.
Yeah, and we're going to get to those issues in just a second. Is it your take though? Is TPA is a new TPA necessary? Should the Biden administration want to go ahead with this?
So it's an interesting question, and we were talking about this before. The TPP itself was signed within an existing TPA, the one that's about to expire. And so, normally you could bring that up after the expiration under fast track rules, under fast track procedures. It's a little bit, this is sort of a novel situation because, of course, President Trump announced that we wouldn't be proceeding with ratification. He what is sometimes colloquially called unsigned the agreement. It's not technically unsigning. He doesn't, literally erase the name. At the end of the day, this would, I think, really be up to the leadership in Congress as to how they wanted to handle it. If they wanted to say, well, a renegotiated, slightly tweaked CPTPP is really the same agreement, then they could bring it through. And of course, we saw the Obama administration do this with some of the Bush 43 era trade agreements that didn't quite make it through at the end of the TPA that President Bush was operating under. So the 2002 TPA. So that it's certainly possible, but again, that would involve congressional leadership really owning the decision to rejoin TPP by determining that this was the same agreement that the Obama administration had signed.
Yeah, that's an excellent lesson for all of this, which is that as much as one may want to sort of parse every sort of paragraph and codicil of these agreements, in the end, if the leadership in Congress gets together and wants to do something, a lot of things can happen. Tori, you sit fairly near Congress. Let me just toss a whole bunch of this to you, what you see as the scenarios there. And I also want you to come back to the UK, which is sort of a centerpiece of Trump administration efforts. What does it mean is this the best vehicle for that, something through the CPTPP, or does this bilateral have a strong constituency?
Yeah, so in terms of Congress, I think Tim really hit the nail on the head on pretty much everything having to do with the CPTPP and what it would take to get in there, what it would take to get back in, and on the question on what to do, what role TPA plays. It's not impossible to make that happen, but you have to also remember that this is likely not something that would happen anytime in the next year or two, which means you might have a new makeup of Congress, and that has some factors in there as well in terms of who's going to be the leadership in the House and the Senate, who will be the leadership in the committees of jurisdiction, with some really important members not running for re-election, including Kevin Brady on House Ways and Means. So Congress really is a big question mark, I think, if it's not something that will be pushed in the next 12 to 18 months. On the conversation of the UK, I think it's probably clear to a lot of people that the Heritage Foundation has been advocating for a US-UK FTA for the end of time, since the beginning of time. We would love a US-UK FTA. I think a bilateral would be the ideal option, one, because the agreement is basically done, not to mention a large group of some very fantastic think tanks that includes the Heritage Foundation actually wrote what the most ideal US-UK FTA would be from cover to end. So there's some great options out there for that, but I think it's probably right that the most likely outcome would be that the UK gets into the CPTPP and then the US follows later, whenever that might be, and then we get a sort of backdoor agreement. But I think that the rules could be very different than the sort of clean-cut rules we get between a US-UK FTA alone, because obviously the US and UK are much more similar in terms of our economies than a lot of the other more developing countries that are in the CPTPP. If that makes sense.
No, it does. Thank you.
Can I add one thing, Phil, just quickly on this? Tori's really nice piece that she highlighted earlier sort of highlights this, but I'm not sure we've said it, which is that TPA is contained in a statute, but it is not actually a law. What it is a rule of parliamentary procedure. And so either House of Congress on its own initiative can turn what we often still refer to as fast track, can turn fast track on or off. And so Speaker Pelosi, during her first tour as Speaker, turned it off. When we talk about what's the source of that flexibility there, and how much of this is law versus how much of this is politics. TPA is itself really is the most political kind of law in a sense, even though it's in a statute.
It's a very interesting point, and one that sort of took a while to dawn on me. It seems like it's in some ways, this is my non-lawyer perspective, a useful fiction that many people like to rely upon, because it has, if you go back, it really has driven negotiations often. When you were having sort of active multilateral negotiations, this dates me, but I was in Geneva in the summer of 1990 when they were desperately trying to finish up the Uruguay round. The reason they were desperately trying to finish up the Uruguay round was because U.S. fast track authority was expiring by the end of the year. And so that was traditionally what set deadlines. And they got an extension, and so it finished later. But it was really this sort of U.S. thing. So for those, and this is often a challenge in trade negotiations, is everyone wants to show their constituents, I held out till the very last moment. I didn't sort of give up market access easily. It was the final second of the final hour. Well, what is the final second of the final hour? It was often given by these deadlines. But then, exactly as you say, Tim, yeah, kind of, but Congress can move it around if they feel like it later. So,
it's a very useful. One more thing in there really quick too.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you bring up a great point, and I think that under the Trump administration, we saw a push even further of, okay, when do the negotiations actually stop? Because after USMCA was signed, sealed, delivered, things were all good. We were ready for it to get across the finish line. It sat for months and months. And then there were additional negotiations that happened with Democrats behind closed doors, and major changes made, and then additional side agreements that had to be made with Mexico to get them to agree to these rapid response mechanisms on labor and environment. And did the negotiations really stop? Now, in the past, I think that similar sort of changes in the margins post-signing did happen. But in my reading, not to the degree or to the fundamental change level that happened under USMCA. So, with that being said, does TPA really guarantee you a stopping point?
Yeah. So I think the lesson we're taking from this is guarantee is such a strong word that it's very suggestive of a stopping point unless somebody powerful in Congress wants to do something different. But on the other hand, so it doesn't guarantee a successful outcome. It's hard to do a bunch of stuff without it. And I think as we're sort of looking over these historical lessons, and Tim had raised this earlier, this was part of the theory of the Obama administration with TPP, was that, in fact, none of this putting negotiations on ice business that I talked about. You can go out and have great negotiations. You can do all this stuff. You can, bracket text. You can remove brackets, all the fun things that negotiators like to do. And it won't matter because all you really need to do is have TPA at the end. The problem with that is it does send a bit of a signal to other countries about when are you serious and when do you actually have a domestic constituency. And this gets to the difference, and I'm happy if either one of you wants to, challenge this, but the difference between our system of government where you have the different power bases versus, say, somebody who has a parliamentary majority, and then there's much more confidence that their trade minister can push through whatever they negotiate and their parliamentary majority would deliver. That this ends up being a sort of a unique problem, both of the significance of the U.S. as a negotiator, as a negotiating partner, but that challenge. Is that fair, Tim, or am I misreading this?
Yeah, I think that's right. The history of TPA, we sometimes forget this, is that President Johnson in the 60s negotiated some, as part of what was called the Kennedy round of negotiations, some agreements that would have required congressional authorization. This was before fast track existed, and Congress balked. And so fast track is partially the lesson learned from those who want to push trade agreements through more easily in Congress. We haven't really put it to the test, to try to do a major negotiation in the absence of TPA. I think it's a fair statement that it has become the signal that, hey, now we're serious. Now we, the United States, are serious about doing this. But at the same time, I do think there's a question in certain political constellations whether or not you might be able to do it without TPA. And then obviously TPP tells us also that TPA is not a sure thing. It doesn't mean the agreement will get done because Congress can still vote no, as seemed likely at the end of the Obama administration.
No, that's right. All right, I want to use a little of this history to move us on to issues. And you see that I have a date up there, which will be very familiar to the two of you, but let me just refresh for our audience, which is you had this time just as this earlier stretch of TPA was expiring, when the Bush administration had gone out and negotiated a number of deals. It was Colombia, Panama, Korea. They were there, they were pending. You then had a Democratic Congress come in, and the question was, how were they going to get along? How are they, would the Congress actually pass on some of these deals, which were not all popular? And the Bush administration said, well, we have TPA. We have the authority to push these things through and call them up for vote. We're going to set aside some of the questions about suspending timelines and all that. The part that I want to focus on at the moment is the issue agenda, and which is that there were negotiations between the Democratic leadership in the House and between the Bush White House on what should trade agreements cover and what should they, and that's where you had a number of these issues that became known as the May 10th issues, because that was when the agreement was struck in 2007, if I recall. And so this was more attention to labor issues, more attention to the environment, some limitations on what would happen with intellectual property rights, and some restrictions as to what would happen with foreign investment. That if there was at least I know because I talked to them, it was the interpretation of the Bush administration. If they did these things, they would then get votes on Peru was in there as well. They would get votes on all of these deals. In the end, they only got the Peru vote. They didn't get the others, and the others didn't go through till 2011. Tim, let me start with you on this one. Was that significant as we sort of think about the sort of range of issues going forward in the next TPA? You've worked on a number of these. How much does TPA serve as agenda setting, and how much do we have a consensus on what ought to be in trade agreements?
So, Tori and I have been doing so much agreeing that this may give us an opportunity to disagree a little bit.
I have hope on this one.
Yes. So, TPA does serve as agenda setting. Congress sets out what it hopes the negotiating objectives will be that the administration will follow. And if Congress determines that the administration doesn't follow those negotiating objectives, then it can decide that TPA doesn't apply to an agreement. And over time, those negotiating objectives have expanded. So the May 10th agreement clearly expanded what was considered core parts of trade agreements. And the labor and the environment provisions we've seen in every iteration, they have gotten more significant. And so, the first labor and environment provisions were, of course, in the original NAFTA. And then the May 10th agreement makes them much more significant. It brings them into the core of the agreement. The Obama administration during TPP negotiated what are called consistency plans with countries like Vietnam and Malaysia. And then we move in USMCA to the rapid response mechanisms. So, I think any new TPA is likely to up the ante on labor and environment in particular. That labor and environment, you're going to see significant interest in Congress in pursuing labor rights as part of any trade negotiating agenda, and in my view, that's appropriate. I think that the entire sort of question of the relationship between both domestically labor and overseas labor and our trade agenda is something that has really is a matter of bipartisan concern. I think you see elements. Core elements of the Republican Party as well as core elements of the Democratic Party that are very interested in pursuing that kind of agenda. And so I think any new TPA is likely to have to take that on and probably move the ball forward. Trade agreements tend to be very path dependent. There's a lot of kind of copy and paste from the last version with sort of incremental changes. And I think this is an area where you'll see an incremental step forward in any new TPA whenever it comes.
Now, Tori, I read your paper as arguing for a slightly different approach. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. My read on the way that TPA has gone and the sort of trajectory is that I feel as though, and it seems as though to me, that the gains from trade agreements, the trade gains, the lowering the tariffs, the non-tariff barriers, are diminished. They're not as much of a focus of the trade agreements as they've been in the past. And for, us as average Americans, that's where the gains are for us, is getting to have more affordable goods and fewer barriers on what we import and what we export. So I would like to personally see a TPA that gets back to the basics, of promoting free trade. And I don't want it to come across here that I don't think that labor and environmental policies are a priority. I absolutely do think that they are important. And I think that in the trade context, that importance is narrow. So, for example, countries can agree on, basic ILO standards for labor. The U.S. law prohibits the importation of products made with forced labor and slave labor, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection enforces that law to the best of their ability and should enforce it more. But those are things that the U.S. is already doing that I think just are not the focus of what a trade agreement should be. Same thing on the environmental standards. The U.S. has its own climate objectives. We have the Paris Climate Agreement. Those things are separate from trade agreements. And when we make trade agreements more and more bloated, it results in it being less about eliminating barriers and increasing gains for the individuals who are doing the trading amongst the countries. So I have been asking myself the question: are the gains that were made under the USMCA on the left side, is that the new May 10th? Is that the new sort of baseline? And I think Tim points this out there that I think from Democrats it will likely be we're going up from here, and I'm going to be trying to advocate for the opposite.
Tim, did you want to say a word in favor of bloat?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that to some extent, what is trade related is in the eye of the beholder, and so the beholder's view has changed, and I think that you just don't see much support again on either the right or the left for the view that trade agreements should be exclusively concerned with reducing barriers. One of the things I think you're likely to see is carbon border adjustments coming down the pike. The European Union is already moving forward with this. So it's not a question of whether the U.S., what we think about it. The European Union is going to do it. And so the question is, once those kinds of climate measures are a core part of a trade policy with one of our major trading partners, how do we respond to that? How do we incorporate that into our trade policy? I think leaving it out of our trade policy is just not it's not politically realistic, but it's also not in the interests of U.S. business. If you're starting to see these kinds of measures with our major trading partners, we need to be actively thinking about how we're going to implement similar measures and how we're going to sort of marry up those measures with the measures that our trading partners have adopted. And beyond that, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about the politics, but I think if you're in favor of preserving I think what are the great gains from trade liberalization, and potentially having future trade agreements, I think the last 5 years have really taught us that hinges on paying attention to these other issues politically. And so, the politics of this, I think, are just not the same as they were during the Clinton-Bush 43 years.
All right. So you did the segue beautifully. So this is not at all to cut off the discussion of these issues. In fact, it's just to put it in the context, which is we've already said we've got the current TPA expiring in 8 days. Now let's try to imagine what could come next. How would we have a new TPA? There is certainly a precedent for being without it for quite a while. That's what we talked about with the TPP where the previous version expired in the middle of 2007. It wasn't until basically this time of year in 2015 that we got something back. What I put up here, and then I'm going to let you guys go at it again, is this question of, is it possible to have bipartisan committee to work together to have an agreement on, here's this new consensus, and Tim was sort of describing this. This is what trade should look like. If you look at what happened, and the most contentious vote was in the House of Representatives. They had to vote twice in 2015. It didn't quite work the first time. Some of this had to do with trade adjustment assistance, which I'm going to ask you to say a word about, Tim, which was supposed to be something which sort of compensated losers, alleged losers from trade. But if you look at this, I put the table up for what were the votes for that sort of second vote in the House of Representatives. You'll see this is a very narrow passage for something, that it ended up being 218 to 208 that this passed. So 5 votes would have flipped things. You'll also see it was a heavily partisan vote. Of those 218 votes, 190 came from Republicans. And this is whereas only 28 came for Democrats. And recall, we were at a moment when these were Democrats voting to give trade authority to a Democratic president. This is with President Obama in office. An awful lot has changed since 2015. That was a time when you had especially a lot of congressional Republicans who were, devoutly attached to the idea of open trade. You had sort of leaders who did this, some of whom are about to depart, as Tori alluded to earlier. If we think about the politics going forward, I'm going to start with you on this, Tim. What kind of coalitions are you imagining? What kind of prerequisites are there to get new TPA through?
Sure. So I think you're right to start with trade adjustment assistance. Trade adjustment assistance has been intimately linked with our trade negotiation agenda since 1962. So it was a Kennedy initiative that was designed, as you say, to compensate the losers from trade. When you moved, when you liberalize trade, one of the things that happens, of course, is that you disrupt certain sectors, and then so there's a sense that we as a political community should essentially help those people transition into new lines of work once that if they lose their jobs due to trade liberalization. So TAA, as distinct from TPA, is has been renewed at virtually every TPA renewal. So you basically don't get TPA without TAA. TAA also is expiring next week. So, you're talking about a sort of a joint expiration of 2 programs that are politically very linked. And there won't be a new TPA without a new TAA. I think that the TAA, there's been an effort in the House to try to decouple TAA and TPA, but the effort is to renew TAA, that is trade adjustment assistance, before TPA. Because there's a sense that the Biden administration is not pushing for trade promotion authority. I still don't think that that's a sufficient condition for TPA, but I do think it's a necessary condition. There just won't be any support among Democrats for a new trade promotion authority bill unless and until there is a new trade adjustment assistance bill as well. Now, there are questions about whether trade adjustment assistance as a program, as a policy, could be designed to function better. And I think those are important questions that I hope that Congress is going to take up as it revisits reauthorizing TAA. But just as a political matter, it's a core component. What those labor provisions in trade agreements that are focused on other countries, they're focused on labor conditions in other countries. TAA is what does that for work labor in the United States. I think you cannot divorce TPA and TAA politically. They're going to move together or not at all.
Thanks. Tori, what's your take on the politics?
Yeah, so I think that the slide that you showed, Phil, is really interesting because you're right to identify that TPA was largely advanced by Republicans in 2015, but that was kind of the old coalition. of getting trade across the finish line, whereas under USMCA, you saw a much more robust bipartisan, this obviously TPA was still bipartisan, but robust bipartisan support for USMCA and getting that across the finish line. Even the labor unions, the AFL-CIO, was in support of the USMCA, which was shocking, I think, to a lot of people in the trade community. But my big question, the thing I'm wrestling with right now is that a sustainable coalition? Or is that a coalition that was a sort of blip in time, and then the Biden administration will be forced to create a new coalition? I think probably the latter is more likely. I see slowly many folks on the right shifting a little bit closer to their free trade roots. If you see some of the things that have come out of the Republican Study Committee lately on trade, you see Kevin Brady and Senator Crapo on finance being much more vocal on trade, and I think you're seeing that come down the line in the Senate more than the House. But the idea that potentially the Biden administration could ride the wave of the USMCA sort of coalition, I don't think is going to happen. And so that calls into question, how are you going to get the votes? And if Democrats are wanting to take TPA even further on what I would call non-trade related items, you're going to see more and more Republicans peel off their support for the mechanism, and that will get it really hard to get across the finish line.
Okay, we're going to come back to both of you for your predictions as we get to our close. Want to ask the audience for a prediction first, and you got to be quick with your trigger finger here because we're running short on time. But with all that we've said, when do you in the audience think you're going to see the next U.S. trade agreement come into force? You told us at the beginning that you did care about new trade deals coming in, that this actually did matter to your business. We've talked about what some of the countries might be. We've talked about what some of the prerequisites. Do you think you will see the next one come into force, which means, of course, both signed and passed by the Congress, that this is now affecting the rules and the tariffs under which you trade? Is it going to be by the end of 2022, 23, 24, or 25 or later? So this is one where I don't have to be very intricate in terms of laying out the details. Simple dates. So a bunch of you have voted. Let's get some more in there. Pick a date, any date. When do you think that the next U.S. trade agreement is going to come into force? Which you can, presumably this will involve TPA, but I leave that to your interpretation. So, all right. Thank you for those who have voted. We're getting towards a critical mass. Need a few more views. So take your very best guess. I agree there's actually a lot of uncertainty here, but going once, going twice, you guys said, all right, very narrowly, end of 2023, but coming in almost on a par with that is 2025 or later. I think if I were going to vote on this, I would be in the 2025 or later camp. Let's take each of you in turn, and you can use this as your sort of culminating statement. Briefly, Tori, where are you on this? What's happening next?
Yeah, I'd say definitely after the midterms. For sure, I think you'll see at least a 2-year lapse in TPA. Maybe CPTPP at the second half of the first term, maybe, but likely not until either second term of the Biden administration or a new administration afterwards.
All right. And Tim, what's your take?
I agree. I think if what we're looking at is the date of entry into force of a new agreement, you're likely looking at after the next presidential election. I think that I think Tori and I disagree a little bit on normatively the way this negotiation should go, but I think we're pretty much see eye to eye on the descriptively what's happening. And the Biden administration just doesn't look to me like it's got a lot of interest in trade negotiations until Congress has some pretty significant support, well above the levels that you showed from 2015 for negotiations. So I think you're looking at 2025 or later.
All right. A little bit of a grim note to close on for those of us who are enthusiastic, but we call it straight here. I would like to, we're running short on time. First, big thanks to both Tori and to Tim for sharing their expertise with us. To all of you, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available shortly after our conclusion and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Please save your spot for the next COVID-19 biweekly seminar and for our State of Trade webinar series. Thank you for joining us, and please stay safe. With that, we conclude.